Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to what I believe is the last of this term's Center for Southeast Asian Studies noontime talks. I'm John Chorchari. I'm a faculty affiliate, and I also teach at the Ford School. We're very pleased and privileged today to have visiting us Dr. Alice Baugh, an associate professor at the University of Delaware. Alice, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for a long time, is an expert in a number of issues of interest, I'm sure, to many of you, including Southeast Asian international relations generally, the construction of regional order, and Southeast Asia's relations with major external powers such as China and the United States, and also Japan. She's the author of many influential articles in the field, has been published widely in some of the top journals in IR and area studies, covering Southeast and East Asia. She's also the author of a really excellent book that I commend to you called Renegotiating East and Southeast Asia, Regionalism and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And in this book she does, she accomplishes the impressive feat of tracing the evolution of ASEAN itself and the surrounding regional order, looking at how some of the centrifugal forces within the association's membership then contributed to a set of norms, practices, and institutions that turned out not only to be conducive to a sense of regional identity, but also then to be exported, in a sense, to a broader array of actors in the Asia-Pacific. One of the flashpoints, of course, that has often been of concern to ASEAN and its neighbors is those all-important maritime routes coming through the Straits of Malacca and through the South China Sea. And today Alice is going to speak about a little bit of her research on security and safety in the Straits of Malacca, and interestingly about the role of not just state but also non-state actors. When we're reading the press and we're seeing all that's going on in the South China Sea, for example, very often it's pitted as, there's China and there's the United States and other billiard ball nation states interacting. But I think one of the things that's great about Alice's research, today's topic included, is that she goes beyond that to look at other actors that are important, whether it be civil society, whether it be private corporations, whether it be regional or international institutions. So I'm sure you'll all enjoy it very much. I will get out of the way and welcome Alice to give us her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and playing host. And I know it's a busy time of semester, so I am especially appreciative of that. And thank you very much, John, for inviting as well as for that lovely introduction. So as John mentioned, my talk today draws from a project that I've been recently been revisiting. And it actually is spun off of an original interest in actually ASEAN and ASEAN security cooperation. And as I was looking into this, into some questions about building security regimes in Southeast Asia, I also came across some very interesting developments as regards the Nippon Foundation. And so the thing that I want to kind of highlight today is kind of thinking about both states. I will talk a lot about states still, as you'll see, the different kinds of states. But then also, of course, the role played by basically an unconventional actor in terms of building cooperation in Southeast Asia. So specifically, this paper considers the creation in 2007 of a new cooperative mechanism designed to promote the safety of the Malacca and Singapore Straits. The emergence of this mechanism is interesting, not least because of because the safety and security challenges associated with the Straits have long been known. But politics and sovereignty have also long complicated, just as long complicated, the creation of a cooperative maritime regime in Southeast Asia. So I'm going to structure my talk in the following way. First, what is the nature of the problem? What is the practical problem? What's the political problem? What explains the creation of new interstate governance mechanisms in 2007 and 2008? And what does the case really tell us then about the actors, the drivers, the conditions, and the processes of cooperative regime building in Southeast Asia on this particular issue? And as I'll explain, this case both affirms and challenges our conventional international relations understandings and explanations that emphasize the roles played by large events and large states. Rather, the cooperative mechanism draws attention to a more protracted and incremental process that involves the roles played by less conventional actors, namely private and semi-private entities like Japan's Nippon Foundation, as well as the International Maritime Organization, and also smaller powers. So let me start with the practical and political problem. Practically, the topic regards the world's second most busy waterway. And you can kind of see it, actually I think I have the wrong chart there. You can see on the map here geographically what it looks like. It is a historically, as many of you may know, it's a historically important trade route, and it serves as a critical transit route for trade in commodities between East and Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. 64,000 to 94,000 ships pass through the Straits every year, in fact. And the chart there to the right is a list of the world's busiest ports, and I've highlighted 3 of them that sit along the Straits. As such, the security and safety of the Straits concerns a range of actors and interests, both states and industry, local, national, and global interests, trade and strategic concerns. And certainly it concerns more than Southeast Asia, as you will find. It may be useful to just briefly kind of sketch out for us who some of the key actors are, so that you'll know who we're referencing. There are, of course, the littoral states, and these are the Southeast Asian states that border the Straits, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Thailand is also very close by and will also join in some of the cooperative measures. The concerns for these states regards questions of sovereignty, autonomy. They are local economic interests. So their interests, again, are also characterized as distinctly local, in fact. So one category of actors are the littoral states, and they exist alongside user entities. That is pretty much everyone else that has to rely on the Straits to get things from one place to another or to move from one place to another. For these states and these actors, their primary concern is unhindered safe passage. Okay? We can also add another category or a subset, and these are, of course, larger states like the United States, China, and Japan, who want to protect their economic interests, but also have strategic interests and even global interests at stake. The United States is certainly in that category. These are states that are, again, considered user states, and it is often assumed that these states can really generate incentives for new cooperative regimes, right? And generate incentives for new cooperation. To return to the distinct challenges associated with the Straits, both geography and high-volume traffic combine to produce a situation in which one can expect a greater probability of collisions, a greater probability of grounding, of ships grounding, a greater probability of oil spills and other environmental hazards. The geography of the Strait also bears on how vulnerable the Straits are to piracy and terrorist attacks, thefts, and hijackings. And here you can see from this map where those incidents are most likely to occur. Okay? And basically it's where the Strait narrows. It's off the Indonesian coast, often relatively close to shore, and specifically off of Aceh province, where governance of the Strait has long been plagued by local tensions as well as capacity challenges of the Indonesian government. For example, lack of patrol vessels, poor training in terms of enforcement officials, and the like. In short, the Straits has been associated with a number of challenges that have economic and strategic implications. So, safety of navigation, piracy, armed robbery, debris, maritime security, for example, terrorism, the environment, air pollution, oil spills, trafficking and poaching, and all of which can be summed up in terms of the challenge of sea trade hindrance. Okay? For a long time, again, we've known about these challenges and obstacles. We've known about the significant commercial and potential strategic costs should something happen in the Straits. But not much has really happened, until relatively recently. These challenges got a boost in attention at the start of the 21st century. And it began with a number of high-profile, big-impact events. And again, IR scholars love high-profile, big-impact events. So some of them that are commonly cited as explanations, as I'll elaborate upon, include a string of terrorist attacks between 2000 and 2003, the October 2000 attack on the USS Cole, the October 2002 attack on the Limburg, which is a French oil tanker. And even though these two incidents did not take place in the Straits in Southeast Asia, they did highlight, they involved seaborne attacks that many saw as comparable to what might also happen in the Straits in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, you compound that with other incidents around the same time, the attacks in Bali, the attacks in Jakarta, which basically brought special attention to Southeast Asia as a particular site of all sorts of activity like terrorism. So in addition, around the same time, we also had a more than one publicized bad year, a very bad year in terms of the number of piracy and armed attacks in the area of the Malacca Strait. So all this, of course, combines to increase attention and the salience of the Malacca and Singapore Straits in basically international consciousness. That's something that needs to be done, again, as the standard explanations go. The coincidence of these two developments raised in particular the specter of a terrorist piracy nexus in the Straits. Meanwhile, others call attention, others looking at the emergence of the cooperative mechanism, others call attention to a 2005 report by the Lloyd's Market Association. And the Lloyd's Market Association basically underwrites hull and machinery policies for the shipping industry. So in other words, its reports, and in this case, it declared the Straits a war risk zone, increases the insurance premiums to the shipping industry. So all this would suggest that it would create a lot of pressure for greater action. So, and indeed, conventional explanations tend to link these events to the emergence of the cooperative mechanism as well as the Malacca Straits patrols. Basically, two important pieces of what we can characterize as a maritime security and safety regime, cooperative security and safety regime in Southeast Asia. Specifically, again, the standard explanations for this regime formation in international relations is to emphasize things that are big, right? We like big events. High profile, high impact events. We like big actors. We especially like big states. Okay, big actors and big states have the resources to make things happen, whether it is funding things themselves or providing public goods. Big events create urgency. Big states can also offer new incentives that attract other states and other actors to cooperate. Okay, so that's how IR has generally understood and explained cooperation in many areas, including this one. But while these big things are not unimportant, and as you'll see, they do have an effect in terms of the process, they also prove to be somewhat unsatisfactory. Okay, they prove unsatisfactory and insufficient, I think, in explanations in terms of both how these things evolved, what they look like, and they also tend to obscure, I would argue, longer-term historical processes that are ongoing in the region. They can also be blind to the interventions of unconventional actors. For example, they can overly minimize the ways that the local intervenes to produce varied outcomes. Consequently, some of their effects, the effects of large events and large powers, has also been somewhat contrary to expectation. Okay. In this case, for example, we find that large events do introduce instabilities in the default status quo positions held by various actors. We find that large events introduce pressure to basically reassess existing practices and existing policies. But beyond that, the conventional explanation gets complicated. Viewed more closely, for example, it becomes clear that the sense of urgency varied considerably amongst the different actors. Okay? While events had a pretty large effect in generating interest from bigger actors, the United States and Japan most notably. Smaller states, specifically the littoral states of Southeast Asia, tended to be much less mobilized. In fact, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, these states actively worked to de-securitize the question of the Straits' safety and security. In other words, they actively worked to lessen the sense of urgency associated with the events that I've just highlighted. Moreover, if we look at the actions taken by the United States and Japan, we additionally see that the IR argument that big actors can make cooperation more attractive by providing critical public goods is a complicated and challenged argument in terms of questions of causality. Most notably, the United States, which following events moved to propose and provide for a new regional maritime security initiative, found its efforts rebuffed. In fact, the regional reaction from littoral states was strong and immediate, compelling the United States to backpedal and retract. More to the point, Malaysia and Indonesia were quite simply reluctant to concede to an extra-regional power the freedom to conduct patrols and law enforcement at what they considered at will. Okay. In the end, the U.S. initiative did mobilize states, okay? But it mobilized regional states not around the U.S. table, but instead in support of an alternative arrangement, namely the Malacca Strait patrols, a non-U.S. mechanism in a preemptive move against what they saw to be U.S. intervention. So here we have local ideologies that are based on autonomy, on sovereignty, on non-intervention, intervening in response to great power initiative. The cooperative mechanism of the Straits offers in many ways an even more interesting contrast, not least because it directly engages the more technical differences between states and actors. As they say, the devil is in the details. In the 2000s, there was certainly growing interest and demand for greater cooperation amongst various actors. But what agreement there was tended to fall apart when it came to drawing up and agreeing upon proper arrangements and how to share responsibility. So returning to the cooperative mechanism, it focuses on shared responsibility. Okay, so it focuses on shared responsibility for the Straits. Specifically, it coordinates dialogue and cooperation between the littoral states and user entities to strengthen safety of navigation and to strengthen environmental protection in the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. Created in 2007, it was also preceded by the creation in 2005 of something called the Tripartite Expert Group on Maritime Security, which sits at the top of the structure in terms of the cooperative mechanism. There are 3 cooperative mechanisms or instruments. We have the Cooperation Forum that serves as a platform for dialogue between the different interested parties. We have the Project Coordination Committee, which coordinates implementation of various projects. And we have the AIDS to Navigation Fund, which receives direct financial contributions from the international maritime community to maintain marine navigational tools to prevent accidents, to prevent crashes, to prevent, again, oil spills and the like. Okay? So participants include the 3 littoral states, and as you can see, some critical actors that are extra-regional to Southeast Asia. They also include the International Maritime Organization, the Malacca Strait Council, and the Nippon Foundation. Okay. A number of details are worth noting about how the cooperative mechanism works. For one, littoral states, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, take the lead. Specifically, they take the lead through the Tripartite Technical Experts Group. That is, again, comprised of experts and senior officials drawn from the 3 littoral states. These are the ones that also initiate consultation with the maritime community and users of the Straits. Extra-regional actors take part via the other pieces of the mechanism, but they play mostly consultative and funding roles. Each has been solicited to fund and support individual projects. And here you can see in the list of projects how the distribution of responsibility is understood as regards each of the different projects that are associated with the cooperative mechanism. And this list, by the way, has been changing and expanding as we are able to check off things that are being done. Okay? So again, the areas covered by the cooperative mechanism, areas of safety, environment, aids to navigation, maintenance, removal of wrecks, are all areas long recognized as posing hazards to those that are transiting the Straits. But these areas, again, have been long complicated by critical differences, again, between the different principles. So let me elaborate just briefly on some additional differences that complicate the construction of what a regime would look like. Okay. So we can talk about the littoral states. The states that border the Straits. And littoral states proved reluctant, again, due to a combination of sovereignty reasons, as we saw in their reaction to the United States initiative. But all three littoral states also have taken a very strong position that any mechanism should be supported financially by those who use the Straits. Consequently, while they support the idea of a cooperative mechanism, they also don't think that they should be the ones shouldering the financial burden for basically what is a public good. Okay. Littoral states argue that those who use the Straits should also shoulder the costs. And again, they draw on UN Law of the Sea, Article 43. As you can see here, this is the burden sharing, in a sense, clause. At the same time, as we saw in their reaction to the U.S., they're also strongly opposed to extra-regional actors taking on too much initiative of their own and assuming responsibility, and they are very wary of ceding authority to extra-regional actors in leading or managing the Straits. User states have somewhat different concerns. User states, they take the legal position that the Malacca Strait is an international waterway. And what this means is that even though littoral states have sovereignty, they cannot restrict free and innocent passage through the strait. Similarly, to ask user states or user entities to pay for use would also challenge what they see to be the right to the freedom of navigation. And in addition to these states, it's also worth noting the position taken by industry, you would think that industry would be one of the primary proponents of creating a safer environment for their considerably expensive goods and ships to go through the Straits. But for the shipping industry, the economics have been actually quite simple, and it does not work in favor of cooperation. For them, it's simply easier and cheaper to pay the ransoms and higher insurance premiums in case of possible attack than it is to pay for the certain costs of safety and security mechanisms. Furthermore, they are also concerned about setting a bad precedent, where if they were to contribute to a cooperative mechanism in Southeast Asia, that they would be similarly asked to do the same in other regions around the world. So for these industry actors, reports of increased piracy attacks and other hazards are certainly a concern, but they also generally, in addition to the economic arguments, also generally saw these reports as dramatically exaggerated. Okay? And this has a lot to do with how these reports of incidents are covered. So we focus on absolute numbers of events, right? We count how many take place in every year, and we note that the absolute numbers have increased over time. But when you put it in the context of also dramatically increasing traffic, this is a real concern for those that actually sit along the Straits. The percentage and the statistics of you actually getting attacked is actually quite low. So the shipping industry, again, has taken the calculated decision to gamble that they won't get attacked. So the shipping industry has not been a particular supporter of cooperation. So in fact, what I like to say about the Malacca Strait on the question of cooperation, at least, is that what we have are not interested parties, but actually disinterested parties. And again, here you can see I've kind of separated their different concerns in two categories, sovereignty and economic. The cooperative mechanism attempts to bridge these divides, and given the outstanding differences between the parties, it's probably not a surprise that analysts have characterized the mechanism as a, quote, historic and, quote, milestone breakthrough politically and practically towards the enhanced maritime cooperation between the different parties. Still, quite clearly, the cooperative mechanism was not the product of a natural confluence of interests. The question then is, by what process were these different actors able to bridge their differences enough such that they now work together in a regularized process in which different user entities are responsible for different areas of Straits security, and that by most analysts' assessments has done actually relatively well, at least towards addressing the issues that are covered under the cooperative mechanism. Now, as I'll explain, there are still significant deficiencies, but nevertheless, in general, there is the assessment that the cooperative mechanism has worked to bridge some important differences such that important needs and functional challenges, safety and security challenges, are also being addressed. The process reveals a number of interesting details and considerations. The first is the role of Japan. In fact, in the user state and user entity category, Japan's commitment to Straits security and safety has been the most sustained, going as far back as the late 1960s. Moreover, until the 2000s, Japan stood out as the only state that has participated in cooperation on navigational safety in the Straits apart from the littoral states. Over the last 3 decades, Japan has been at the forefront among external states in supporting cooperative efforts, and well before the recent adoption of the cooperative mechanism. Second, the fact that Japan's interest goes back at least to the late 1960s points to a need to take again a longer-term view of cooperative efforts. In other words, the emphasis that so many place on recent events, while not wrong per se, nevertheless may exaggerate the significance of those events as transformative events. Taking a longer view, for example, shows that in the case of Japan, its interest in Straits governance is not simply the product of recent events, but rather the product of a series of events that again go back to the late 1960s. So here we see that on the one hand, dramatic events do matter, but in Japan's case, again, we see its interest actually being peaked much earlier. So we can cite, for example, some incidents that took place in the 1960s. There are also other incidents that analysts typically don't emphasize that happen only to Japan that also serve to build momentum and sustain interest in promoting certain areas of cooperation as regards the Malacca Straits and Malacca and Singapore Straits. Looking at the process with a longer view reveals other things. It reveals the role played less by Tokyo as the government of Japan, but instead by non-state, semi-private actors. In short, what is often attributed to, quote, Japan, is actually a much more complicated thing. And as regards the specific question of the cooperative mechanism, it's not Tokyo that's taking the lead. Rather, the actor that has taken the lead has been the Nippon Foundation of Japan. In fact, in the late 1960s, Tokyo was kind of hands-off, wasn't interested in being too involved. So it was the Nippon Foundation of Japan that in the late 1960s began to promote the question of Straits safety and security as an important basis for cooperation amongst different interested parties. This is again not to say that Tokyo is uninvolved, and it is true that the relationship between Nippon and Tokyo has been an evolving one, but nevertheless it is significant that it is the Nippon Foundation, an actor that is not a state, that has done the most to put the UN Law of the Seas, Article 43, into practice. Again, Nippon's role goes back to the late 1960s. Since 1968, the role played by the Nippon Foundation has been both monetary and facilitative, and this will lay the foundations again for the cooperative mechanism. Monetarily, the Nippon Foundation has been the largest subsidizer of the current cooperative mechanism. It is also the largest subsidizer of its predecessor, which is basically the Malacca, so here's the Nippon Foundation. And then it has also been the largest contributor in terms of something called the Malacca Strait Council that preceded it. So again, you can see the Nippon Foundation is playing a monetary role, and as I'll also explain, a facilitative role. So in addition to the cooperative mechanism, as you can see, from 1968 to 2012, and actually we can say till 2007, there was a prior arrangement that lays the groundwork, as I'll explain, for the cooperative mechanism. And that's the Malacca Strait Council. So the Malacca Strait Council was created in 1969. It is a private, semi-private entity that draws funds from various actors towards, quote, route maintenance of the straits. And again, you can see here that the Japanese government does contribute, but its contribution is only 5%, in contrast to the 74%, or in other words, the bulk of the council's activities is funded by the Nippon Foundation. The rest of the money comes from the Japan Maritime Foundation and from industry. Two additional points can be observed about the MSC. First, until 2007, the MSC characterized what can be characterized as kind of a loose governance arrangement towards promoting and managing the question about safety in the straits. As noted here, it's a governance arrangement that is funded and supported largely by a non-governmental entity, even if it takes its cues from littoral states. The second point we can make about the MSC is the one that I've just suggested, and that is that it provides the cooperative mechanism some of its genetic origins, so to speak. It's the cooperative mechanism's Aid to Navigation Fund has direct lineage to the MSC. Similarly, it's not a coincidence that the TTEG, the Tripartite Technical Experts Group, was revived roughly around the same time as developments within the MSC. In addition, we can also cite other things that are associated with Nippon's activities. In the late 1990s, it created something called the Nippon Maritime Center, specifically and explicitly devoted to the question of straits safety. In 2007, it provided also, as regards to the cooperative mechanism, its startup costs, and fronted much of the money that would lay the basis for the cooperative mechanism. Its logic was that it would get the mechanism going as a way to encourage further cooperation. In addition to its very significant funding role, the Nippon Foundation can also be seen as playing a facilitative role. And I think we can say that it's done so, or at least think about it as having done so, in a few related critical ways. The first is to think about it in terms of convening power. The second is that it has a kind of agenda-setting power. Third, it's played the role of consensus builder. We can also add capacity building, which other states and other actors also do. And so the Nippon Foundation, in addition to the funding role, has also played a facilitative role in these various ways. Now, those that I talked to in Japan and those associated with Nippon seemed a little uncomfortable with some of these characterizations. So, for example, some are uncomfortable with the idea that Nippon has played a coordinating or agenda-setting role, though they also acknowledged, quote, that it had become so. Further, they made the observation that Nippon, precisely because it was not a state actor, was less offensive as an initiator, and more flexible in its position, thus allowing Nippon to perform a role that other actors could not, which was namely to provide a, quote, node around which others can link up. This view is also generally supported by those that work on the question of the cooperative mechanism in Singapore and Malaysia. Thus, since the 1970s, and especially the early 2000s, the Nippon Foundation has exercised these various roles and influences by, for example, joining with other actors, littoral states, the IMO, especially in the 2000s, in sponsoring and convening specialized workshops and conferences. And in so doing, it has helped to, quote, familiarize and reinforce particular focal points for cooperation. It ensured that cooperation is also constituted by a particular set of actors. Or what one longtime participant in the process has characterized as, quote, maritime people. Here it may be noted that the Nippon Foundation, more than any other entity involved, has also played the largest role in outreaching to industry. Previously, it brought industry in via its inclusion of industry and various, especially Japanese industries that depend on the Straits. Previously, it brought industry in via their inclusion in the Malacca Strait Council. It has also actively engaged other industries that are based elsewhere, in particular the Baltic and International Maritime Cooperation Organization, or BIMCO, the International Association of Independent Tanker Owners, Intertanko. And more recently, it has engaged industry through a concerted effort to promote corporate social responsibility vis-a-vis these shipping industries, to say that what they should be doing in promotion of their own good self-image is to do good works. Okay. Unfortunately, though, that effort by Nippon's own admission has been less successful. As one Nippon official put it, they've been the way he characterized it led me to say that they were stingy, and he said, "I would prefer you not to use that word, but yes, they have not been forthcoming." But in any case, the industry has been definitely stingy. So Nippon has also, especially since the early 2000s, actively used various forums to multilateralize the involvement of the different actors and principals in the process. So again, we can think about Nippon's role then over time and over various venues in promoting certain common focal points that get, again, reinforced over time. For example, burden sharing in particular, the fact that certain sets of actors should be part of that burden sharing arrangement. That process has served to promote clarity in areas that should be prioritized, clarity in terms of relative responsibilities of the different actors, and what cooperation should look like. Also in the early 2000s, and especially since 2004, although some place this a little earlier, Nippon has also injected additional urgency into the process. And most notably, it announced that it would begin withdrawing funds. It would begin withdrawing funds from the Malacca Strait Council, and that it would only be committed to funding those startup costs for 5 years in terms of the cooperative mechanism. Okay, an announcement that may have factored directly, especially in terms of its announcement on the MSC, may have factored directly into the creation of the cooperative mechanism in 2007. Notably, its decision was not based on events, those dramatic events that I highlighted earlier, but rather Nippon's own changing interests and Nippon's conceptualization of Japan's changing interests, and also a general sense of fairness. So Nippon officials explained that in the late 1960s, it made sense for them and Japan, they would argue, to take a stronger role because they relied so much on the Straits for their own security and well-being. However, in 2015 and 2007, in the early 2000s, a number of states, including China, increasingly also rely on those straits for their well-being, safety, security, etc. And so they're feeling that in the interest of fairness, greater burden sharing, not less, should be promoted. And so they announced in the mid-2000s that they would no longer be supporting these frameworks in the same way, in the same disproportionate way, as they would put it, as they once did. So they promoted equitable cost sharing and, again, a more active effort to multilateralize the process. Again, this announcement seems a little contrary to expectation, given how analysts have associated events as creating urgency for action. Instead, for Nippon, they're looking for what they called a peaceful exit. The announcement also is additionally interesting because the call for burden sharing from other user states and user entities in calling for greater contributions, they've also expressed disappointment at others, including China, for not having done more. And so this position is interesting, if only because it seems somewhat contrary from the directions of Japanese foreign policy, Tokyo's foreign policy, that we have as we have understood in the last 10 years. In fact, one Nippon representative acknowledged as much, and acknowledged the diversity in priorities between Nippon and Tokyo, where Tokyo promoted bilateralism and Nippon was promoting multilateralism. So what can we conclude? We can make a few possible conclusions about what the Straits may tell us about cooperative regime building in Southeast Asia. First, large events do matter, but they can destabilize the status quo. But large events are also clearly insufficient in terms of generating agreement, either about the severity of an event or what should be done about it. Moreover, in the case of Japan and the Nippon Foundation, what we find again is not one set of events, but rather series of events, historically over time, over the course of 4 decades. Cumulative effects. Second, the case raises questions as to the roles played by larger powers in creating cooperative frameworks in Southeast Asia. The conclusion here is not that large powers don't matter. Quite clearly they do. In fact, large actors do often create pressure and for action among historically more resistant states. Similarly, it's quite clear that in Southeast Asia, larger powers tend to lead in the areas of material contributions. In fact, this is quite an established pattern. You have local initiatives that are funded by extra-regional actors. I mean, we see this, everything from high security and high policy issues to low policy issues, like funding a tourism event, right? So nevertheless, the case also shows that their effects and impact are heavily conditioned by regional actors and regional expectations. Again, the U.S. proposed Regional Security Maritime Initiative is especially instructive, where again, it didn't attract states to a U.S. initiative, but instead galvanized them to create an alternative non-U.S. arrangement of their own. Ultimately, one conclusion drawn from that case is the importance of local and regional initiative. As one Singaporean analyst put it, that in order for something to be successful in Southeast Asia, local actors have to be allowed to take the lead and the initiative. For those of us who are IR students, one way to think about this then is that major powers still play critical roles in supporting and creating regimes. But smaller and local actors may in fact determine both what kinds of goods are provided, as well as how they are provided. Lastly, the cooperative mechanism itself offers instructive lessons and insights. Again, it provides justification or provides a basis for thinking about the merits of looking at taking a longer-term view of regime creation in East and Southeast Asia, as opposed to looking at single moments in time. It shows the different ways that local agendas can intervene to direct large power roles. It also shows the facilitating roles played by unconventional actors and semi-private bodies like the Nippon Foundation in convening actors, familiarizing and reinforcing focal points, building capacity, and building consensus. Through Nippon's support for first the Malacca Strait Council and then the Cooperative Mechanism, Nippon has basically performed the role of a kind of unconventional governing actor. It has institutionalized a burden-sharing concept in these various mechanisms, both the MSC and the Cooperative Mechanism, as expressed, burden-sharing as expressed in UNCLOS Article 43. And again, we can also think about how, as these things have become more successful, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, projects 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, of course, are increasingly being checked off, and this list is now being expanded. So I'll conclude it there, and I welcome your questions.
It's very interesting. Oh. Thank you. It's very interesting when you mention at the end this split between sort of Nippon trying to promote multilateralism and the foreign ministry and other elements of the government promoting bilateralism. As you know, semi-public, semi-private organizations here in the U.S. that operate abroad are often seen as tools of American foreign policy. And the same you mentioned could be said at times of Nippon. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how Nippon's governance organization functions. What do you regard as ways in which it could be construed as being in line with the government, and why in this instance is so different?
So and this is actually a question that I've been trying to investigate further. So I'm not going to have a complete answer, but some things I can tell you. So I think that their relationship was closer in the 1960s. So, and again, I have somewhat contrary reports in terms of how Nippon came to this particular mechanism. But but it appears that actually Tokyo was first solicited. Right? So there was some interest amongst the littoral states, actually, in terms of generating external funding and support for basically safety mechanisms in the Straits. But Tokyo was not interested. And so, one report, in any case, says that Tokyo reached out to Nippon. And so Nippon took on the responsibility. So that would, of course, suggest that there's a relatively close relationship. And I think that, especially in that early period, I think in all likelihood, there's great consultation. I think also, one of the things that's also interesting about Nippon is that its status actually has changed. So around the mid-2000s, its official status has also changed. So now it is officially, a non-governmental organization. So this is why kind of the terminology is also I wouldn't call it, as you may have noticed, I call it an entity that is not a state, okay? But I'm not sure I would characterize it as a non-state actor throughout this process, but it's clearly not government.
Sorry, two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is just the basic one. How would such patrols on the Straits operate? And the second one is just general. I don't believe you really mentioned ASEAN in all of this.
Right.
And how does it
I
fit?
didn't.
So those two questions.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. With respect to your first question, so, there are, again, two pieces to this kind of regime, this cooperative regime. One is the patrols that you just referenced. And those are solely handled by the three littoral states, and now also Thailand. So Thailand is also, if you'll recall, is also part of that now. Let me find that slide. Sorry. Probably I should just, or we'll just look at, here it is. Just look at that one. Yeah. So, so it's purely by the littoral states. Now, again, it has to do with the way in which authority and jurisdiction is projected. So the responsibility is solely in the hands of the littoral states. But extra-regional actors, for example, might support those efforts through training, through equipment, and through other resources. As for ASEAN, yes, ASEAN has not been part of it, although, and I don't have the slide here, but actually these are not the only mechanisms now. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of a cluster of things that have emerged since this thing has emerged, or around the time that this has emerged. There's actually also other pieces. And they're all somewhat a little different, but these are the two that are directly focused on the Malacca and Singapore Straits, whereas the others are much more general in terms of their interests. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Good presentation. I have a question about the cooperative mechanism about the security, because European Union has the big kind of the cooperative organization such as Frontex,
Right.
which is in charge of the border security all over the European Union. So, what do you think about such kind of the establishment of such kind of the organization of security in Asia?
Yeah, so, one of the things that's been so significant, less about the cooperative mechanism, but of the patrols, is that it is this first instance of where you have basically an institutionalized, in this case, trilateral and now quadrilateral, I guess is that the right word? Quadrilateral, mechanism where you have the different states in Southeast Asia, a subset of states in Southeast Asia, working on a regular basis, both at sea and in the air. And so in that sense, this is a very significant thing. I think if we're going to talk about it in terms of, like, let's say, responding to other kinds of emergencies, other kinds of disasters, and the like, that would be highly problematic. Right, I think this is where ASEAN would also come in. And ASEAN has basically approached these instances on a more ad hoc basis, but it has remained very much constrained in terms of its ability to, to politically intervene, let alone have a more established mechanism. Indonesia, for example, has at various times promoted the idea of an ASEAN force of some kind, and that has not taken hold. Is that? Y'all want to go to lunch?
Okay, another question is how to align the relationship between such kind of the cooperation and the international law, because the UNCLOS has established more than maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So these kind of the mechanisms should comply with the UNCLOS or search and rescue convention. So how to utilize such kind of the international mechanism?
Yeah.
To these kind of...
So especially in the Cooperative Mechanism, the International Maritime Organization has been very involved. Although, again, I think, so there is also a set of analyses of this mechanism that tends to attribute a lot of responsibility to the IMO. And that's partly because some of the key events, in terms of immediately preceding the creation of the Cooperative Mechanism was at least co-sponsored and organized by the IMO. But again, the Nippon Foundation participated in each of those events as well. And again, if we're going to look historically, Nippon interest goes much further back. So, but there's no doubt that in terms of the cooperative mechanism that they are basing it on UNCLOS Article 43. So, we are talking about burden sharing. The question is about, how, about what kind of burden sharing should take place. And one of the things, UNCLOS has been an evolving regime. It's a relatively new regime. And so, when you think about, international law, it's practice, right? Evolving practices can also affirm and build international law. And so you can say that this cooperative mechanism serves at least this notion that UNCLOS, because it institutionalizes the idea of burden sharing. As someone put it, we no longer talk about whether different parties should be cooperating. It's just a question of how they should be cooperating.
So there's this very interesting case where you've demonstrated both the local interests, when I say local, I mean the literal states, in taking leadership, and then Nippon being able to convene and to set an agenda, but in a way that isn't unduly threatening to those actors. And so I wonder how much that is particular to sort of the circumstances in the Straits of Malacca, or whether there are elements or aspects of this that we could think about extending more broadly in the region. The South China Sea being the most obvious example, but other contested areas, and whether or not you hear people discussing that at all.
Yeah, I think, it could certainly potentially, I think, provide a model of sorts. I think this case clearly highlights that there are real problems associated with certain extra-regional actors, especially if it's asserted in a particularly forceful way. So the United States asserted it fairly forcefully. Okay, Japan has another initiative, which I know you're familiar with probably, but has another initiative that actually has not been ratified, however, by Malaysia and Indonesia, but that also encountered similar kinds of resistance. So we can't say, for example, that it's just because it's Japan and Japan is less, controversial than the United States. It really does, I think, at least the way I see it in terms of these cases, that the Nippon Foundation's role is partly a function of its unique kind of status, but also the way in which it pursued initiatives. From the beginning, it was clear that littoral states would take the lead in identifying certain kinds of project priorities, for example. I think, is it translatable? I think, yeah. I mean, if we look at the South China Sea, one of the critical areas has been that there aren't any neutral third parties that are legitimate in terms of kind of doing things. The United States, as we know, Hillary Clinton offered at one point, but China doesn't believe that the United States is a neutral party. And so, not surprisingly, that offer was rejected. So I think that, it could, although that case has obviously become so much more complicated.
Can you give us a quick thumbnail sketch of the genesis and the players that created Nippon? How do you introduce?
Yeah, so, the money from the Nippon Foundation, I was thinking about this actually earlier today. We talk so much about these corporations like, Bill Gates, et cetera, being philanthropic with their money. And basically, Mr. Sasakawa did the same. He made a lot of money out of gambling, raceboat gambling. So they come from somewhat nefarious funds, I guess you could say. But that's where the money came from. And now they do a lot of different works around the world. I mean, maritime safety is actually an area that they are moving away from, even though this has been such a part of their agenda historically.
Just briefly, could you tell us how Singapore operates?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it, actually. So in terms of the cooperative mechanism, it benefits most Indonesia and Malaysia. Okay, so if we look at the three littoral states, and if you remember that map, the geography of the map, the challenges have a lot to do with Indonesia. Okay, in terms of where the incidents happen, in terms of the capacity challenges of the Indonesian government. Also, Indonesia, the three littoral states, has the least economic interest. Okay, because most of the revenues are generated by port visits. Okay, you transit through, you're not paying anybody anything. Okay, but if you stop to refuel, reload, just get dinner, what have you, there's money involved. And Indonesia doesn't have the ports. Okay, so it lacks the infrastructure. So Singapore, to kind of get to your question about Singapore has mostly funded it itself. So its contributions are less, so Nippon doesn't affect Singapore as much. If we're going to think about the cooperative mechanism, Singapore, of the three states, has been more supportive from the beginning, even though it has also taken, alongside the other two states, a strong position that littoral states should take the lead. So that part they share. But Singapore is the richest of the three, and it makes the most money of the three.
So I missed your presentation, unfortunately, but maybe you went over this already. So retroactively, would Nippon Foundation have any role in advocacy? For instance, in a case like the shrimp turtle case with WTO, would they have a role in something like that?
I'm not as familiar with that case. So,
okay. Okay. Well, I can either talk to you after you're
Okay.
done with this and then ask you. It's basically a trade-related case. Where preferential treatment was given to certain countries by the U.S.
Yeah.
And the ones that sort of were not able or were disadvantaged were Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. So they filed a case at WTO for them to be able to
Right.
trade shrimps and turtles, which was through a certain kind of, they needed a certain kind of safety net for it. But essentially my question would be, would they have a role in advocacy with respect to trade policies that have to do with trade within the sea, sort of sea relations with it?
So my understanding in terms of its interest, on the maritime safety question, is that it's fairly restricted in terms of what it's been involved in. And again, there's a whole list of it's a philanthropic organization. And so the list of things that that has also addressed are things like leprosy, poverty in India. There's a whole host of things. And I think, the reason that maritime safety was on its agenda, which is a much more high-profile issue, has to do with, again, its links to the shipping industry, and also, again, because, Japan had relied so much on the Straits in terms of trade and commerce.
Thank you.
You mentioned some of the challenges of engaging industry on this issue. Wondering what you perceive to be the ideal role of industry and what measures could be taken to engage industry in this.
Yeah, so I think, at least in terms of this case, unfortunately, it doesn't give much room for optimism. Although, in some ways we have two sets of actors, right? Nippon itself, as a private actor that made its money in the private sector, has played an important leading role. But the shipping industry that, relies so much on the Straits, have really not done much. Just to give you an example of how little they're doing, their contribution to the cooperative mechanism is to publish pamphlets. Yeah, I know. I know. Yeah, yeah. So this is the extent of what they've been doing. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, if you can engage the right actors, I think that's probably what it comes down to. If you can engage the right actors, they could play a much more facilitative role, in the same ways that, Nippon itself does. But so far, in terms of the vested actors, in this case at least, they have been more reluctant to do so. And again, I think partly it has to do with the precedent. They just don't want to be responsible for doing the same, everywhere else.
Just about out of time, but I would like to thank all of you for coming, and of course to thank Professor Baugh for a really insightful and informative presentation.
Thank you.